It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to make the solo ride down to visit my sister in Southern Oregon. I've always preferred riding at night. The roads are quieter, and there's something peaceful about the hum of the bike under a sky full of stars. That evening, I was about halfway through my trip, cruising along a deserted stretch of highway with the moon as my only company. I'd always been cautious about spotting fake cops. It's something you read about in forums or see in the news. A car with a magnetic light slapped on top, pulling someone over for no good reason. But this looked different. As I rounded a curve, I noticed flashing blue and red lights in my mirror. They lit up the dark road behind me, growing brighter as they closed the distance. The vehicle was an unmarked SUV, black with tinted windows. It had the strobes built into the grille and everything, just like you'd see in an official car. I slowed down, shifted to the right lane, and hoped it would pass. Maybe I'd been going a little fast, but it wasn't anything crazy. To my surprise, the SUV slowed too, staying on my tail. I pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. I always make it a point to keep my gloves on and my helmet off. It's a trick someone taught me to look less threatening in situations like this. The SUV stopped behind me, the lights still flashing, and after a few seconds, the driver's side door opened. The man who stepped out looked the part. He had the uniform, complete with a badge clipped to his chest. His belt was loaded with the usual gear, a flashlight, handcuffs, and what looked like a holstered gun. His face was obscured in the low light, but his posture was calm and authoritative, the way you'd expect from someone who'd done this 100 times. "You in a hurry tonight?" he asked as he approached. His voice was low but carried over the empty highway. "Not particularly. Did I do something wrong?" I asked. "License and registration," he said, ignoring my question. Something about his tone struck me as odd, not hostile, just off-script. Most officers I'd dealt with in the past at least explained why they pulled you over before asking for your paperwork. Still, I reached into my jacket pocket and handed over my license. The registration was in the saddlebag, so I gestured to it. "It's in there. You mind if I grab it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." As I moved toward the bag, I glanced back at the SUV. The lights were blinding, making it impossible to see inside. No markings on the doors, but that wasn't uncommon for unmarked vehicles. What stood out, though, was the lack of a dash cam. Even the undercover cars I'd seen before had those. I handed him the registration, and he studied it for a moment. Then, instead of walking back to his SUV, he stood there, thumbing the edge of my license. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "To visit family," I replied. "Southern Oregon." "Riding alone?" "Yes." His face was unreadable, but something in his demeanor shifted, almost imperceptibly. He looked up and down the road, as if checking to see if anyone else was coming. "Mind if I see your helmet?" he asked suddenly. That caught me off guard. "My helmet?" "Yeah, just hand it over for a second." I hesitated. I'd never heard of a cop asking to inspect someone's helmet during a traffic stop. My helmet was nothing special, just a plain black full face, but the request felt strange. "Why do you need to see it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. "Standard check. Just hand it over." Reluctantly, I took it off the seat and passed it to him. He held it for a moment, turning it in his hands like he was looking for something. Then he set it down on the ground carefully, as if he didn't want to damage it. "Step back from the bike," he said. "Is there a problem?" "Just step back," he repeated, his hand moving to the holster on his belt. Step back, heart pounding as I tried to figure out what was happening. His stance had shifted. It was subtle, but he was angling himself between me and the bike, blocking my path to it. Then I noticed something. There was movement in the SUV. A shadow, faint but undeniable, shifted in the passenger seat. Someone else was inside. Before I could react, headlights appeared in the distance. A vehicle was approaching, the sound of its tires growing louder as it neared. It was an old pickup truck, the kind you'd expect to see on backcountry roads. The truck slowed as it passed, the driver clearly curious about what was happening. He lingered for a moment, his headlights illuminating the scene. I caught a glimpse of the driver, an older man, his face lined with curiosity and concern. He must have thought it was some kind of accident. The man in the uniform stiffened. His hand dropped from his holster and he took a step back. "You're free to go," he said abruptly, handing me my license and registration. I blinked. "What? Go on. Get out of here." I didn't argue. I grabbed my helmet, started the bike, and pulled back onto the road. As I rode away, I glanced in my mirror. The SUV's lights were off now, and the man was walking toward the passenger side, where the shadow in the seat had started to move. The pickup truck had pulled off a short distance ahead, the driver watching me ride away. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he and his passenger had planned, but I'm certain that pickup driver's curiosity ruined their timing. Without him, I might not have made it out of there. We'd been on the road for days, heading east, picking roads that didn't show up on any tourist map. It wasn't so much about the destination as it was about the journey. Our Triumph Bonneville had been a steady companion, though not the sort of bike that would draw attention. We didn't want to stand out, just wanted to keep moving and see where the road took us. By the time we reached upstate New York, the sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky a dark blue with a streak of orange at the edge. Claire had been scrolling through her phone for a while, trying to find somewhere decent to stop. She found a few places, but none of them were close enough to where we were, and the last thing I wanted was to keep riding after dark. Then we saw the sign, a hand-painted wooden board that read "Cabin for Rent" with an arrow pointing down a narrow gravel road. I figured we could give it a shot. It wasn't like we had many options. The road had been empty for miles, no sign of other travelers or any towns nearby. We took the turn, and the gravel crunched under the tires as we moved further away from the main road. The cabin came into view after a couple of miles. It sat right on the edge of a lake, Lake Ontario, as I later learned. The setting was picturesque in an almost eerie way, the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a movie, but it wasn't exactly welcoming. The cabin was old, with wooden planks weathered from years of storms. A small dock stretched into the water, surrounded by thick trees. The evening had grown colder, and the air carried a dampness from the lake that made everything feel isolated. There weren't any other cabins around, not even a sign of a house for miles. We pulled up and parked the bike. The door of the cabin creaked open, and an older man stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward us. His face was lined with age, and his gray beard and wild hair gave him the look of someone who hadn't bothered with a razor in a long time. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn jeans. There was something about his presence that made him seem out of place in the middle of nowhere. His eyes were tired, but he smiled as he introduced himself. "I'm Hank," he said, extending a hand. "You folks looking to stay for the night?" He shook his hand and agreed to rent the cabin. He didn't say much else, but showed us inside. The place was simple: a couple of old chairs, a small kitchen, and a wood stove. There were old fishing rods leaning against the wall, and a bookshelf with a few worn novels. A large window overlooked the lake, the view quiet and still. We unpacked quickly, and as I started a fire in the stove, Claire sat by the window, her phone in hand. It was one of those rare moments when the world felt still, and for a few minutes we both just sat there, listening to the occasional sound of the wind and the waves. The lake was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, and I thought we'd finally found the peace we needed after days on the road. It wasn't long before we heard it, a distant gunshot. It echoed across the water, sharp and sudden. Claire glanced up from her phone, a frown tugging at her lips. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded. It didn't sound like hunting, more like a warning shot or something far more deliberate. The shot was followed by silence, and then another one, this time closer. My eyes went to the window, where I could see the dark shadows of trees and the outline of the lake, but there was no sign of movement. Hank had disappeared after showing us the cabin, and the more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea of staying here overnight. Something about that gunshot made the air feel heavier, and I began to wonder if we had made a mistake. Still, we decided to wait it out. We'd been on the road long enough to know it wasn't always easy to find a place like this. The night came, and the sounds of the woods grew louder, branches creaking in the wind, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. We tried to ignore the unease creeping in. Claire went to make some tea, and I busied myself with securing the bike outside. As I was walking back to the cabin, I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned, and there, walking down the path, was a man. No, not Hank. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved with a certain purpose, and as he came closer, I realized he wasn't just walking. He was scanning the area. His eyes flicked toward me as I stood by the door, and he nodded, but there was something cold in his demeanor. He asked if we had seen his brother. Said his car had broken down a few miles up the road, and he was looking for him. I didn't say much. Something in the way he spoke felt rehearsed, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. I was about to ask him if he needed help when another shot rang out in the distance. This time, it was even closer. His expression didn't change, but I noticed the way his hand twitched slightly toward his jacket. My instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. I told Claire to stay inside, and she glanced nervously at the door as I stepped outside to talk to the man. He kept asking about his brother, but his questions didn't make sense. Why had he come all the way down here, walking miles in the middle of nowhere, without even knowing which cabin to check? It was starting to feel like a setup, like this man had some other reason for being here, something more than just a lost brother. Just then, as if on cue, the man shifted his stance slightly, and I noticed a glint of metal under his jacket. A gun. I knew it in that moment, even before the realization fully hit. I wasn't dealing with someone lost or worried about a missing brother. I was dealing with someone who was probably waiting for us to be vulnerable, to make a mistake. I looked back toward the cabin. Claire was standing at the window, watching, her face pale. The man noticed too, and that was when I knew we had to get out of there. The gunshot wasn't an accident. It was a warning, a distraction. They were going to rob us, take the bike, maybe worse. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice steady, but my mind was racing. He didn't argue. He simply turned around and walked back down the path. But something in the air had changed. There was no way I was going to wait around to see if he came back with backup. I went inside, grabbed our stuff, and told Claire to get her boots on. We didn't pack neatly, just threw everything into bags and rushed outside. As we loaded the bike, I kept an eye on the trees, the road, everything. The man had disappeared into the dark, but we weren't taking any chances. We left in the middle of the night, cutting through the gravel road as fast as we could. I wasn't sure if anyone followed us, but I had a feeling we weren't alone in those woods. All I could think of was getting out, getting as far away as possible, and hoping we'd never have to look back. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. It was late October, and I was riding home from a weekend trip in the mountains. The air was crisp, the road empty, and the night unusually quiet except for the low rumble of my bike. I had about 70 miles to go before I hit home, and I wasn't in a rush. Just me, the stars, and the stretch of highway ahead. I first noticed the truck a little after midnight. Its headlights appeared in my mirrors, distant but steady. At first, I didn't think much of it. This highway was mostly used by semis and locals running late errands. I figured it'd pass me eventually, but it didn't. Instead, the truck maintained the exact same distance for miles. It wasn't speeding to overtake me, and it wasn't slowing down to fade into the night. Just a pair of high beams fixed on me like a hunter tracking its prey. I decided to test it. I eased off the throttle, letting my speed drop. The truck matched my pace. I sped up. So did the truck. Now I was paying attention. The vehicle was an older model pickup, boxy, with those blinding halogen lights that made it hard to see anything else. I couldn't make out the driver or even the license plate, but its silhouette was unmistakable, looming against the black sky behind me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were headed to the same destination or weren't paying attention. Still, the unease settled in my gut. The next gas station was about 15 miles ahead, and I decided to pull in there and let the truck pass. As I approached the station, I signaled early and slowed to make the turn. The truck followed me into the lot, pulling into a space a few rows behind where I parked. I stayed on my bike for a moment, pretending to adjust my gloves while watching the truck in my mirrors. The engine was idling, but no one got out, just the faint glow of someone sitting in the cab. I killed the engine and walked inside, trying to act casual. The station was small, one of those places with a single register and shelves full of snacks and road maps no one ever bought. The cashier was a young guy, maybe 20, more interested in his phone than the lone customer who walked in. I bought a bottle of water and hung around, glancing out the window. The truck was still there, headlights off now, but engine running. "Friend of yours?" the cashier asked, nodding toward the lot. I shook my head. "No, just some guy." The cashier frowned, but he didn't say anything else. I lingered a little longer, waiting to see if the truck would leave. When it didn't, I decided to head back out. I'd barely swung my leg over the bike when the truck's headlights came back on. The engine roared to life and it pulled out of the lot, turning onto the highway. I exhaled, feeling a small wave of relief. But then, instead of driving off, the truck stopped just past the gas station exit. It sat there, idling on the shoulder, like it was waiting for me. I tightened my gloves, started the bike, and rolled out slowly, keeping an eye on the truck. Sure enough, as soon as I merged back onto the highway, it pulled out behind me. This time, it was closer. I was done playing games. I twisted the throttle and surged forward, pushing my bike to its limits. The truck sped up too, its engine growling like some wild animal. The headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me as they got closer and closer. At this point, my heart was pounding. There were no other cars, no exits, just an endless stretch of dark road. My only option was to outrun it. I leaned into the bike, taking curves at speeds I'd normally never attempt. The wind howled in my ears, and the asphalt blurred beneath me. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. Then, from nowhere, the truck's high beams lit up behind me again. It was relentless, following every twist and turn, closing the gap with every mile. I spotted a small dirt road cutting into the woods ahead and made a split-second decision. I veered off the highway, kicking up gravel as I disappeared into the trees. The truck hesitated for a moment, then followed, its tires crunching on the loose ground. The dirt road was narrow, winding, and full of potholes. My bike struggled for traction, but I kept going, weaving through the trees and praying the truck couldn't keep up. Finally, I spotted a clearing, a small campsite abandoned for the season. I killed the engine and coasted into the shadows, hiding the bike behind a cluster of bushes. I crouched low, heart pounding, and waited. The truck roared past, its headlights sweeping over the clearing before disappearing into the distance. I waited a long time before daring to move. When I finally felt safe enough to get back on the road, I kept my lights off and rode slowly, sticking to back roads until I was sure the truck was gone. I don't know who was driving that night or why they followed me, but I've never forgotten the way those headlights seemed to lock onto me, refusing to let go. To this day, I can't ride at night without glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that old truck creeping up behind me.